The other day I was watching TV and was flipping around and came across the R. Kelly documentary, Surviving R. Kelly. These were the original versions of that. I guess season 1, season 2 is airing. I think the first version aired tonight or last night. But so I watched a couple of those episodes, and what struck me was how closely the stories paralleled between what the survivors of R. Kelly went through and what I went through. And that's fairly disgusting and disturbing in and of itself, the fact that the survivors of R. Kelly, a pedophile rapper, that his survivors would endure the same thing that I, a survivor of the Catholic Church, would endure. That we would be subjected to the same treatment shows you just how depraved the Catholic Church is. The Catholic Church, which is supposed to hold itself to a standard above the level of, mere society, much less the entertainment industry, which is, just about entertaining people, which often doesn't disguise its willingness to engage in depravity. But instead, you have R. Kelly and the Catholic Church engaging in the exact same behaviors, which is thoroughly disgusting. And it's particularly disgusting that the Catholic Church would sink to that level. But the thing that really stood out to me was one of R. Kelly's defenses and the defenses of his team was that the claims of his survivors, especially the more recent claims of his survivors since 2008, especially, in the last couple of years or so, 2018, 2019, R. Kelly and his team's claims are that those survivors' tales are old news. That actually makes me nauseous just thinking about that. That, R. Kelly was acquitted of some crimes in 2008 under dubious circumstances on a lot of technicalities, those kinds of things. And Kelly is now using that acquittal to dismiss the current allegations against him by this whole new group of survivors. And what's so disturbing about that, this old news claim, and what parallels with my experience, is that I've been subject to that same basic old news claim / smear by the Catholic Church. Again, the Catholic Church and R. Kelly and the two respective teams are indistinguishable. The Catholic Church, which supposedly holds itself to a higher standard from the material world, and the entertainment industry, which, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, unabashedly, they're stooping to the same level. Old news. In my case, the old news angle comes in the form of a question that was asked to me by Kevin Killeen. This is probably early to mid-October 2019. So in September 13th, 2019, the Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt released his report of his investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. I was terrorized, traumatized, thrown out of that press conference for trying to want to attend it, even though my case is discussed in that report. I was interviewed twice by that team. That was a horrible experience for me. SNAP then, David Clossy and SNAP held a press conference a couple of weeks later to discuss that press conference, that report, and then SNAP had made a couple of sunshine law requests relative to that. And Clossie had asked me to kind of do a joint press conference with him where Clossie would talk about SNAP's problems with the Missouri Attorney General process, and I would give a survivor's point of view of the Missouri Attorney General process. So on the day of that press conference, Kevin Killeen and I met beforehand, about 5 minutes beforehand, and Kevin Killeen, who's a reporter for KMOX, he and I chatted. We had a few minutes to chat, and I kind of gave him an overview of my story, and he came right out and gave me his point of view, or the point of view that he'd been told by his higher ups, by his editors, by management, which was a simple question: what's new? While that seems different than old news, ultimately it's the same basic question. Saying what's new implies that everything that you're going to hear is old news. Saying what's new implies that there's, in truth, nothing new going on. So I knew immediately that Kevin Killeen of KMOX had at least been sold a narrative, if not held this narrative himself, that there was nothing new to the Catholic abuse crisis in St. Louis. So I ended up talking to him for a few minutes. It was made more difficult by the fact that the KMOX reporter who filmed my encounter with the Missouri Attorney General's office was there and had been told not to talk to me, not to get any footage of me. KMOV refused to air the footage of my being thrown out of the press conference, and he had been given specific instruction by his management not to get any footage of me. For whatever reason, KMOV thinks they're supporting, protecting, helping the Archdiocese of St. Louis, when in truth they're enabling the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And that's actually the first aspect of what's new. What's new to this story. What's new to my story and the story of the abuse crisis in St. Louis is that things are worse than Spotlight. In the movie Spotlight, the press were the heroes. They didn't do the greatest job at the beginning. They swept things under a rug at first, but then eventually the Spotlight team got on the story and wrote it hard and did what they needed to do and got the story out there and broke it. And that's how the story ended up breaking in St. Louis, and how I got involved in the story and came to understand the involvement of Father Valentine in St. Louis and how I'd been affected. So thank you, Spotlight. But whereas the press in Boston, the Spotlight team, decided that regardless of the cost to Boston or the Archdiocese or whatever, they were going to get the truth out because the truth needed to be told. The media in St. Louis has made the opposite decision. They've decided that protecting the reputation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis and or St. Louis in general is more important than the truth and the lives of survivors. And this is a decision that's been made not just by KMOV, but so KMOV is the CBS affiliate, KSDK is the NBC affiliate. You've got KMOX Radio, which is a very well-known radio station, the voice of the Cardinals. KWMU, the local NPR affiliate. It's really startling and despicable how thorough the campaign against survivors by the St. Louis media is. And I would also include the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in that campaign against survivors, that campaign to cover things up, to protect the Archdiocese and or St. Louis. I guess they're trying to protect the Archdiocese in St. Louis. What they're actually doing is they're enabling evil. While the Post-Dispatch initially was supportive of my efforts and me. They've since decided not to comment, to not talk about my story and all the other aspects of this story. So they've shifted from being part of the solution to part of the problem. So one of the things that's new is the fact that St. Louis is now the same as Boston under spotlight, except it's 20 years later and things are actually worse because the media is complicit in the cover-ups rather than the hero to the story, which is just horrible and a big enough story in and of itself. And the list is long enough that I've had to write it down on paper because it's such a long list. You've got, as I mentioned, you've got the Missouri Attorney General, Eric Schmidt. Again, it looks like he's trying to protect either the reputation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. He is a Catholic. His top lieutenant, Tom Albus, is a Catholic. Albus, a family member of Tom Albus, came after me on Twitter, terrorized me on Twitter. I can only assume that Schmidt is, as a good Catholic, thinks he's trying to protect the Archdiocese and his church. That's a massive scandal. You had some of that in Boston, but it didn't go as high up as the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts. That's something that's new. That's a what's new. That's a story in and of itself. You've got the involvement of Timothy Cardinal Dolan, which I've talked about before. That kind of parallels with the Cardinal Egan story. You've got all these dirty cardinals. That's something that's new because that story has yet to be told. I don't think anyone else has ever actually named Dolan. I've named him in a number of cases to a number of reporters, but nobody's actually reported his name. They've never actually printed that. You've got Vos Estis, which is a major story, a major aspect that's new, and that's certainly a new thing. So Vos Estis was, you had the Sex Abuse Summit in Rome in February. Vos Estis was announced in May, went into effect June 1st. I've made now 2 appeals to Rome, to the Vatican, to the Pope, letting them know that Vos Estis has had no effect on the behavior of the Archdiocese of St. Louis in terms of the treatment of survivors. That's something that's new. That's what's new. Another thing that's new, another what's new is the fact that the Archdiocese of St. Louis is in open defiance of the Pope and the Vatican in terms of the treatment of survivors. That's what's new. The Archdiocese of St. Louis has no program for helping survivors, and they aren't even making an effort to hide that on their website. That's another what's new. You've got the whole problem of the abuse of the abused in St. Louis. That's another what's new. Basically what happens to survivors when they try to get help from the Archdiocese of St. Louis. That's another aspect of the story that hasn't been told either locally or nationally. You've got the smear campaign that's being run against me. I'm actually dumbfounded that the Post-Dispatch hasn't picked up on that, because the Archdiocese of St. Louis used the Post-Dispatch to launch and to wage this smear campaign against me, to spread lies about me, what I said, contradicted by emails that the Archdiocese has sent to me, and the mere fact that I met with Archbishop Carlson contradicts words that were printed in the Post-Dispatch. You would think the Post-Dispatch would want to know, to clarify the record. They are uninterested in that. And that's why I've moved the Post-Dispatch from the side of an ally to the side of the bad guys. That's another thing that's new. That's another what's new. Another aspect that's new relative to the Post-Dispatch is the Carlson hagiography that I referred to that ran earlier this summer. At the same time that I was trying to get help from Archbishop Carlson, that I was trying to get him to call off the dogs to end the smear campaign, the Post-Dispatch was writing this hagiography of Archbishop Carlson. I just asked Carlson to end the smear campaign so people would talk to me, people would stop being afraid to me, at the same time the Post-Dispatch is writing these glowing profiles of Carlson. That's something that's new, that's never been revealed. And then finally, you've got the whole terroristic threats thing, where the Archdiocese of St. Louis alleged that I made terroristic threats against them, which was completely bogus, and the police have been called off, and the police know that I did no such thing. But that's the fact that the Archdiocese of St. Louis would make false allegations of terroristic threats against a survivor of abuse by a priest. That seems like a pretty big deal. That's certainly new. That's something, that's a what's new. And you would think that the press of St. Louis, and not to mention the national press, would be interested in that story, but for whatever reason, they're not. Nobody wants to cover this story, and it's absolutely insane.